Hello everyone, the medieval peasant wedding, which somehow combined holy vows, cattle, inebriated uncles, and the occasional fist fight into what can only be characterized as a profoundly rustic fever dream, is where we start tonight. Please take a moment to like and subscribe to the video before you settle in, but only if you truly like what I do here. No glittering parchment, no wax seals, no invites, not even a furious raven flinging manuscripts from roofs. The only way that word of weddings circulated in the medieval town was through gossip. At the well, it generally began with a whisper. "Have you heard? Beatrix is getting married to Thomas." After a day, it made its way to the baker, who then informed the miller, who in turn informed the midwife, who in turn informed everyone she passed, regardless of their level of interest. Even the sheep knew someone was getting married by dusk. Notably, the priest was usually the last to learn. It was impossible to be uninvited. You went if you were still alive and could walk there. Not because you had a special bond with the couple, but because weddings entailed food, drink, and possibly a brawl if the festivities got too wild. The guest lists were not created by the bride and groom. They had no say in who showed up. You can wind up with half the county or 10 individuals. That's the way it was. In peasant economy, having more people meant receiving more gifts, which could mean receiving an additional turnip or chicken. Excellent stuff if you're on gruel. Planning for guests' arrival was necessary, of course, but so was planning for their absence. Some may simply forget, some may be drunk, or some may be dead. One man didn't realize the wedding was happening without him because he was still harvesting barley. Because time was flexible, let's be clear. Any time between breakfast and twilight might be considered noon. Only the sun and people's hazy guesses about how far it had moved since they last looked up from milking a cow were there. No watches. Name cards and seating charts didn't bother the bride and groom. Whether it was a log, stone, or haystack, you sat wherever your behind landed. What if your seat had already been taken by the pig? Unfortunately, that's not good. The pig remains. Formal attire was more of a recommendation than a requirement in the medieval peasant world. In this sense, fashion had nothing to do with refinement or trends. It was about maybe combing the straw out of your hair and not being nude. The bride tried her hardest. To be honest, it was probably not white, but she was wearing her prettiest outfit. White fabric attracted every farm animal within 2 miles, was costly, and was unworkable. She wore brown instead, or grey. Alternatively, off grey, which was white, before 3 harvests, and an incident involving sheep. If it was spring, she may weave ribbon from something remotely ornamental, such as an old curtain, or someone's extra belt, or a crown from wildflowers. She had no idea she would look like a queen. All she wanted was to appear as though she hadn't spent the morning digging onions. Meanwhile, the groom made an effort to appear dignified. Perhaps he should wash his tunic. If he had any hair left, he may comb it. They wore his shoes if he had them. If not, it was barefoot. Rather of being impolite, calloused feet were viewed as rustic. And if he had a faint, pig-like stench, then so did everyone else. Personal hygiene was a relative concept. There was soap, but it wasn't the kind you wanted close to your eyes. Depending on the season or when it rained, bathing was done. Therefore, the majority of visitors did not arrive immaculate. They were clearly human when they came. That was sufficient. Although they were uncommon, accessories had significance. An additional pouch attached to a belt. Chic. The feathered hat. Audacious. A tooth that has not fallen out. Luxury. Unless it was stolen or inherited from a great-grandmother who had once kissed a merchant, no one had jewelry. Kids showed off whatever twig or insect they had discovered en route. splattered in mud. Every day the elderly men donned the same wool cloak. Old women in layers looked at everyone with disapproving eyes and said, "When I got married." However, nobody gave a damn if your sleeves didn't match or your hem was frayed. There was no fashion show here. This was an uncommon respite from labor, a moment of excitement shared by all, and you were almost a king or queen if you came with your boots and your teeth. Anywhere there was room and less than 5 pigs was the wedding location. It should have been the churchyard. The church, no. That was for high-maintenance saints and noble marriages. Peasants made do with what they had, which frequently meant making vows by a grave, beneath a tree, or next to a bandstand-turned-chicken coop. Grass was considered a luxury. The earth was typically either damp and full of unexpected holes or dry and fractured. The entire ritual was held on an area of churned-up mud, liberally seasoned with dung if it had rained recently, as it frequently had. With a forlorn look on their faces, guests arrived in their wedding boots, which were simply their usual boots. There were no repurposed oak altarpieces, seats, or bunting. People reclined, squatted, or stood against the menacingly creaking fences. The elders, like monarchs without a throne, would instantly claim a bench that was brought. The others simply made an effort to avoid falling into a ditch. The ornaments? Nature? Mostly weeds. It was thought to be ambition on par with Martha Stewart's if someone draped a few ribbons or flowers over a fence post. Animals filled the remainder of the scene, with dogs smelling everything, chickens running all over the place, and the odd, bewildered goat photo-bombing the engagement. Then there were the smells, sheep close by, pigs in the field beyond, the subtle yet lingering aroma of cabbage stew simmering in someone's pot. Sweat and ale breath made it more like a medieval cologne sampler than a wedding setting. Nevertheless, people arrived, because setting was irrelevant. A rare respite from the survival was this. It would be preferable to weeding barley all day if the wedding took place in a puddle surrounded by compost. Most of the guests were either sunburned, itching, or 3 glasses of ale into the celebration by the time the bride and groom stepped in front of the priest. The ceremony itself wasn't exactly a Shakespearean event, but that was okay. It was awkward and brief. It was even shorter if the priest had a place to go afterwards. Marriage for medieval peasants wasn't about rings, roses, or heartfelt vows. Clarity of the contract was the main concern. By the 11th century, the church had started to demand that a priest be involved. In actuality, however, a lot of couples saw themselves as married as soon as they publicly consented. You accept me as yours, and I take you as mine. That was the main idea, in a really pragmatic, tax-liable, romantic manner. A blessing and a few Latin mutterings were part of some rites. Not out of modesty, but because no one was ready to put their mouth on another's after going 6 days without soap, most did not entail kissing. After praying and crossing himself, the priest would hasten to his next assignment, which could be yelling at a goose or assisting in the excavation of a grave. There was range for the church. Unless someone inherited a dubious family heirloom or discovered a bent copper trinket, there were no rings. Some couples sealed the deal by exchanging modest tokens, such as a coin, cloth, or a knife. Others merely shook hands and wished that nobody would withdraw before dusk. The secret was consent. It was necessary for both sides to concur, publicly and vocally. In theory, the priest had to postpone proceedings if the bride remained silent and appeared ready to go. But frequently, a parent's harsh look or a reminder that dowries had already been paid sped things up. That was the end of it. No lengthy speeches, no flower petals, no organ music. 2 peasants stood in a muddy yard, accepting a future filled with children yelling, shared labor, and, if they were lucky, 1 nice blanket. The weight was genuine, nevertheless, despite its simplicity. They were bound in that instant, surrounded by friends, animals, and inquisitive toddlers. by words, not by incense or lace. Additionally, words had power in the medieval era, particularly when ale was added. When peasants said feast, they meant that we have a variety of food options now and that no one needs to steal. There was no menu, no servers, and no catering for the post-wedding dinner. All of the village's root vegetables and almost half of its hopes were in a communal pot that had been simmering for hours. Typically a stew, simmering in a pot the size of a small wagon, served as the meal's centerpiece. Leeks, onions, barley, turnips, cabbage, sometimes some dried peas, and, if you were very fortunate, some meat went into it. If someone had been feeling generous or careless, it would have been a chicken. If not, flavor was left up to fate or the salt. No one sat at the tables. They discovered a robust dog, a bench, or a rock. If you didn't bring a bowl, you were forced to eat with your hands or borrow one from your neighbors. Wooden, communal, or hypothetical spoons were used. Most of the labor was done by fingers. The drinks were amazing. Ale was abundant, produced at home, and more potent than anticipated. It burned a little, went down quickly, and added joy to even charred stew. Although water was technically an option, most individuals chose not to use it because it frequently served as a cocktail of microorganisms. Ale, more festive and safer. When bread was available, it was so dense that it could stun a pig. Either it was old and sharp enough to be a weapon, or it was fresh and sour. Only if the cow had been nice that week did cheese make an appearance. Desserts were non-existent unless someone provided dried fruit or berries, and nobody had any faith in the berries, but by peasant standards it was enough. Another bowl, a third, it was a luxury. With crusts in hand, kids ran around. Elders, their gums sunk, gnawed happily. Dogs roamed underfoot, getting more food than they should have, and less respect than they were due. And the feast had significance even without fancy cuts or silver platters. It was an opportunity to celebrate something other than making it through the winter, to be content, and to relax. Because any excuse to gather together and laugh aloud is a victory when your life is dictated by the seasons, plows, and sporadic plague outbreaks. Despite the fact that it primarily tastes like boiled cabbage. Forget monogrammed towels and blenders. The gift registry at a medieval peasant wedding was straightforward. Bring whatever you can carry, preferably living or tasty. The purpose of wedding presents was survival rather than sentimentality. Guests brought what they had, a chicken bound by its feet, a couple of eggs, a piece of hard cheese, or, in the most generous situations, a little bag of grain. These were more useful investments in the couple's new life together than gifts, because nothing says congratulations on your everlasting binding contract like half a dozen turnips. Occasionally, someone might appear with something a bit more interpretive. Even an ancient hoe without a handle, a wooden spoon with bite marks, and a goat with a limp and doubtful vision were preferable to coming with nothing. When you showed up without a gift, folks saw that you were either incredibly courageous or very poor. There was little money. When the majority of peasants did see coins, they preferred to hoard them like dragons hoard gold. Therefore, it was absurd to suggest giving money as a wedding present. The world revolved on goods rather than currencies. Giving the bride a loaf of freshly baked bread or a jug of ale made one feel like a member of the royal family. Gifts were occasionally recycled, which is as medieval as it gets. A goose given at your wedding can return a year later, a little older and more irate, at your cousin's wedding. For more than 10 years, rumors about a single clay jug circulated. Nobody could recall its origin. Nobody wanted to keep it. However, the pair wasn't the only recipient of the gifts. They contributed to community optics as well. Providing something beneficial demonstrated your interest in the prosperity of the household. It conveyed kindness, involvement, and perhaps the expectation that someone would reciprocate with an especially plump chicken when it was your turn to get married. And there was warmth in it. even with the re-gifting and randomness. Although they weren't luxuries, these were the things that folks could afford. Giving anything at all, even if it squawked all the way there, was a gesture of charity in a world where most people had nothing. Each medieval village had its own cast of characters, all of whom were unwelcome and unavoidable during weddings. Imagine it as reality TV combined with a social gathering, except without the cameras and with more goats. The first was the loudmouth in the community, generally an elderly woman with no filter who knew everyone's business. She would begin by blessing the happy couple and conclude by saying, "But we all remember what happened behind the bakehouse last harvest." She was the pot. She wasn't attempting to stir it. The local wise lady, who was a full-time source of rumors and also a healer and witch, then appeared. She would say something like, "May your cows always give milk, unless they don't," and bless the pair with an enigmatic herb that no one could identify. No one wanted to look at each other, so they all nodded gravely. Additionally, you would see the retired soldier who had not been in combat for 30 years, but he still retained a portion of his dented helmet and related the same tale of a conflict that most likely never happened near France. He would yell at the bride and groom and then collapse, and the inebriated uncle, of course. One red-nosed, overly loving and prone to shouting, "Love is war," while attempting to dance with someone's grandma was a common sight in every community. He might present a suspiciously light jug of ale or a bent spoon. It was tradition, though. Beyond the individuals, however, rumors were the wedding's true motivator. For juicy whispers, weddings were the perfect setting. Who arrived late? With the shepherd, who appeared overly cozy. Who sent a gift that bore a striking resemblance to the one they received the year before? Nothing went unnoticed. Someone had a whole notion if there was a stain on the bride's dress. Someone said the groom had been hexed if he seemed pale. The conversation began during the ceremony and would reverberate for weeks, being carried between milk buckets, weaved into bread lines, and ingrained in the communal memory of the hamlet. And, truthfully, it was what people lived for. It was a difficult life. It was free to gossip. If you've ever attended a wedding without a babysitter, picture it with more muck, less teeth, and no supervision at all. That wedding is that of a medieval peasant. There were kids everywhere, not sitting politely or carefully eating their bread. No. Fueled by stolen crusts and sheer mayhem, they were running through the crowd like untamed squirrels on a sugar high. Nobody intervened to stop them. Adults were busy eating, drinking, and avoiding eye contact with their in-laws, not because they didn't care. Without toys or organized play, children used their imaginations. They challenged one another to touch the priest's donkey, hurled mud balls at hens, and raced sticks down puddles. They made use of haystacks as crash mats and turnips as projectiles. Fortunately, there was always at least one child in the stew pot, not in it, but close enough to ask questions. Young children walked straight into the ceremony. Like satchels, babies were either thrown onto the ground or fastened to their hips. Every 5 minutes a child would cry because they had fallen, been bitten by another child, or had had their only snack taken by a dog. Nobody became alarmed. This was typical. The insanity was frequently disregarded by the bride and groom. Sometimes, in the middle of the pledge, the bride would take a youngster by the collar and pass them to someone saying, "Here, yours now." Unfazed, the child would just dart away like a little medieval gremlin. With all the empathy of little landlords, there were occasionally a group of older children who claimed to be supervisors and ruled over the younger ones. "You can't sit there, please. We are permitted to take your bread, yes. Dirt and poor hygiene meet Lord of the Flies." In actuality, weddings were among the few occasions when kids were permitted, even encouraged, to act out totally. It was recognized. As the grown-ups burned off steam, let them do the same. Were they at a wedding at all if they didn't return bruised, scratched, and coated in breadcrumbs from someone else? The majority of the kids were fatigued and sticky when they passed out in hay piles at the conclusion of the day. Some had suffered small wounds, but nobody was shocked. Music was less of a staged performance and more of whatever sound someone could get out of an object in the grand tradition of medieval peasant weddings. If you were fortunate, a local musician would turn up. He knew more than one song if you were lucky. Every village had that one guy who said he could play something, and he was the most common musician: an untuned three-stringed lute, a pipe, a flute, and a single dream. The instrument was occasionally improvised: 2 jugs, a saucepan lid, and a stick, or simply excited whistling through a gap in your teeth. If no instrument was brought, congratulations then. The one wedding hymn they all vaguely recognized was now being sung by a choir of uncles who had been drinking ale. The songs were repeated until someone fainted or forgot the words, whichever happened first. They were also ambiguous and a little inappropriate. When there were drums, they were anything that produced sound when struck, such as barrels or buckets. A well-fed goose in a sack once. Another favorite was rhythmic stomping, which was especially helpful because it could be used as dancing and deterred rats. The repertory is limited. 3 categories accounted for the majority of tracks: love ballads with an unmistakable death at the conclusion, drinking songs in which everyone ultimately perishes. In historical ballads, everyone loses his sheep and dies. Skill was of little importance to anyone. More important than melody was volume. You were a musician if you were boisterous and excited. You were an expert if you had rhythm. You were a legend if you could clap in time without toppling over. Youngsters frequently joined in, contributing high-pitched screams. Dogs snarled in agreement. Sometimes a rooster would attempt to do it alone. Despite the turmoil, it managed to function somehow. The sound design was awkward, off-key, and sometimes frightening. However, it brought happiness, or at least noise, to the atmosphere, and that was sufficient. This was magic to peasants who hardly ever heard music other than the ring of a church bell or the sound of rain on a leaky roof. Short, clumsy magic. It was just a matter of time till the dancing started, and by music we mean rhythmic thumping and someone whistling off-key. And by dancing, we don't mean courtly steps or graceful waltzes. We mean the unbridled energy of folks who have been hunched over a barley field for the past 6 months, stomping, flailing, and jumping with a faint sense of coordination. Peasant settlements lacked practiced routines and formal dances. You had an instinctive, utterly disorganized, but unquestionably genuine celebration. People simply moved, forming lines, circles, or something in between. Clapping, slapping, yelling, and stomping may occur, frequently simultaneously and infrequently in time. Feet kicked up dirt and beat the ground hard enough to frighten birds. Shoulders were encircled by arms. Backs were occasionally unintentionally slapped. From the sidelines, the elderly applauded, supporting anyone who remained upright for more than 3 songs. Some peasants, generally those who had travelled to bigger towns or heard stories from a travelling dancer who had visited 5 years prior, tried more elaborate moves. These courageous people would attempt to leap or spin, only to fall clumsily and act as though they intended to sit down nevertheless. Shoes were not required. Most individuals had either lost them, kicked them off, or realized they were slowing them down by the second dance. The percussion section was made up of bare feet, striking muddy ground. Every now and again, someone fell. Everyone would applaud. It was part of the ritual to fall. Naturally, the bride and groom were expected to take part. They would occasionally be physically pushed into the center of the circle by the chanting and cheering crowd. They danced while laughing, blushing, or pleading in private for someone else to take center stage. Youngsters also joined in, creating their own routines, most of which featured spinning till they tripped. One child in particular was always the first to start a conga line. Where they learned it was unknown. They simply did. And the dancing was honest, even if no one would describe it as graceful. It was happy. "We're alive, we're fed, we're together, let's move," the peasants said. Aal was a must if dancing was improvised and music was optional. Not just a pint or two, but a medieval peasant wedding would not be complete without it. We are referring to buckets, barrels, jugs, and any other container that may contain a fermented liquid without leaking too quickly, since water sometimes contained unpleasant things like frogs, filth, or illness. It was viewed with suspicion. Ale, however, was safer and much more amusing because it had been boiled during the brewing process. Depending on the person brewing it and how little they appreciated subtlety, it might be strong, but it wasn't always. The majority of weddings served a combination of weak ale, which was appropriate for young people and the elderly, and a stronger beer that could knock a mature man cold. The latter was frequently ladled out like soup and kept in big wooden casks. You didn't inquire about its contents, you simply drank it and prayed that the remainder of the night would stick in your memory. There was a free flow of mugs, great if you had your own, you shared if not. Because ale felt clean, and because the idea of germs had not yet been developed, nobody was concerned about them. That searing feeling that tingles? They claimed that was the cleansing effect, or perhaps blindness. The crowd became increasingly boisterous, unruly, and somewhat more disorderly with every round. Belly laughs replaced polite laughter. Narratives grew increasingly dramatic. People began praising the groom's peculiarly formed knees or the bride's grin. A drinking song was always started by someone, followed by a yelling match, a nap beneath the table, and so on. One person constantly had the final cup when they shouldn't have. The type that started singing and finished throwing up behind a haystack. But nobody passed judgment. It was merely part of the custom. Ale was more than simply a drink amid a world of toil, severe winters, and impending death. Social glue was the substance. People talked, laughed, confessed, and sometimes fell into a trough because of it. And it fulfilled one vital function at a wedding. Would transform a holy union into a celebration that everyone would remember with fondness, but no one would recall precisely. Without a little mayhem, no medieval peasant wedding could be considered complete. The kind of anarchy that simmers beneath the surface until someone's elbow pushes the wrong jug, or someone else flirts with the wrong cousin, not necessarily premeditated chaos. First, let's talk about the flirtations. Gold mines for matchmaking were weddings. Technically, you had food, drink, music, and a field full of eligible peasants who had been buried in muck and hopelessness for the last few months. One of the few opportunities to see someone without soot on their face was at a wedding. In essence, it was rapid dating in the Middle Ages. They looked at each other, they offered flowers uncomfortably. Some courageous people tried poetry, which typically entailed rhyming May with hay, but they soon lost their courage. Although most moves entailed bumping into someone and acting passionate, the dance floor was a great place to flirt. Naturally, not every flirting was acceptable, and that's where the argument started. The most typical causes. Someone's intended dance was too close to someone else's. Ale was spilled over a borrowed shirt by someone. Someone's goat was insulted, once more. Mostly including shoving, inebriated shouting, and the occasional wrestling match in the mud that no one really attempted to break up, the fights were rarely serious. Both parties were typically too exhausted or inebriated to recall the topic of the argument by the time it was over. They would exchange mugs, shake hands, and go on. And then there were mishaps. Ale, livestock, and weddings all add up to unforeseen outcomes. They often stepped on chickens. Kids tumbled into barrels. Every time, someone fell into the stew pot. Before anyone noticed, a goat twisted itself in a bride's veil and pulled her 10 feet. She was all right. They cheered for the goat. However, nobody was taken aback. Part of the pleasure was getting into accidents. They provided the locals with tales to recite for years to come. Do you recall old Magda sitting on the beehive during Tomas's wedding? Legend in a flash. Peasants also experienced minor head injuries, unintentional kisses and spilled ale, whilst nobles enjoyed immaculate dinners and practiced toasts. And that felt more real somehow. Every medieval peasant wedding had a moment when someone would glance around and ask, "Hey, where'd the bride and groom go?" Immediately following the 4th drinking song, but before the goat stole the bread. There were sly smiles, arched eyebrows, and mutterings like, "Well, they didn't waste time," as the older aunts nudged one another. Because everyone was aware of the newlyweds' precise whereabouts, or at least their activities. Consummation was more than merely custom. It had legal significance. A drooping straw mattress and a marriage weren't regarded as completely legitimate in medieval Christian Europe unless they were, instance, formally recognized by the Lord. In theory, there were even witnesses at certain weddings. An unsettling blend of tradition and intrigue. However, most settlements prudently abandoned that portion during the later Middle Ages. Usually, the newlyweds slipped away to a barn, a rear chamber, or a hayloft that had been swept specifically for the event. Privacy was a relative concept. Curtains were an extravagance and there were no locks. However, the symbolic removal was what mattered. The people in the community understood. Allow them to disappear. Allow them to connect. Meanwhile, the festivities continued back at the feast. The dancing, ale, and off-key singing continued even though the couple was not present. If nothing else, it provided a topic for conversation. How long do you anticipate their absence? With his own footwear, Betty stumbles. She appeared to be an experienced professional. He is clumsy, according to his mother. No one said aloud when the couple finally reappeared, flushed, rumpled, and slightly triumphant. However, everyone was watching. They shook hands with the groom. Women who had been married since the great turnip scarcity in 1314 gave the bride uninvited advice and proud nods. Some couples never came back. They either decided that now was a good time to begin that home bliss early, or fell asleep in the hay. Nobody held them responsible. They had earned their little respite from muck, noise, and incessant neighbours after years of waiting and months of hard work. Even though there were no honeymoons, they would never receive anything like that stolen hour of solitude. A medieval peasant wedding was followed by a hangover with livestock, rather than a lovely sunrise. The laughter, the music, and the crazy goat chasing had all vanished. Aching feet, empty jugs, and the gradual conclusion by the group that someone had undoubtedly slept in a cabbage patch took their place. From wherever they had fallen, guests appeared. Haystacks, inside sheds, beneath carts, or just cuddled up like big snoring cats by the communal fire. The hair was matted. The tunics were muddy. One of the men had on someone else's cloak and didn't appear to be too interested in returning it. If you could call it that, the feast table was suddenly a battlefield. An upturned stew kettle, half-eaten loaves, ale that had spilled, and the obvious presence of a bird that had obviously been there all night. One shoe was discovered in a tree. A dog had been purchased by someone else. Of course, kids were already up. They were sticky and wide awake, dragging sticks and singing parts of the wedding hymn that they had made up. No one knew where a kid who was carrying a goose egg proudly came from, or whether the goose was all right. Probably still in hiding are the bride and groom. Eventually they would reappear, dishevelled, worn out, and most likely with straw in their hair, prepared to start a new life, of communal tasks, caring for livestock, and minor existential dread. However, they were permitted to continue existing as mythological characters this morning. Cleaning was done by those with stronger stomachs. Barrels were rolled, cups were stacked, and bread crusts were saved. Others just sat on logs whispering prayers for time travel, strong tea, or silence while clutching their heads. The priest passed by with a smug, suspicious expression. He hadn't gone out. He recalled everything. Worse, he was prepared to discuss it. However, nobody voiced any complaints in spite of the mess. The aftermath was one of quiet contentment. The wedding had taken place. They were married. Together the town had eaten, danced, bled a little, and survived. That was sufficient. It's easy to envision elegance when you think of a medieval wedding. Beautiful music drifting through the trees, flowing robes and garlands of flowers. And somewhere that could have occurred. The true legacy of a wedding, however, was considerably less complicated for peasants. It was cooked cabbage, laughing, wounded knees, muck, and camaraderie. The purpose of these weddings was not prestige. The purpose of those spectacles was not to impress. No mood boards, planners, or photographers were present. Presence was what existed and what counted. In addition to attending the vows, the entire community turned out to share in the uncommon delight. For peasants, medieval life was not only difficult, but also unrelenting. The occasional armed noble rampaging through your barley field, taxes, disease, hunger, and severe weather. Joy didn't last long. Fun was suspicious. Weddings, however, were an exception, a group break in the mayhem, a time when voices sung rather than cursed at rocks, when hands covered with dirt carried food rather than implements. It didn't matter whether the drink ran out, the dish was insipid, or a donkey kicked someone. The village coming together to declare these two people now face the world together was what mattered. In their honor, let us all yell and bare our guts. As a result, neither stained glass nor illuminated manuscripts preserved the tradition of the peasant wedding. Stories over bread fires, a song sung during the following harvest, and the smile of a couple enjoying stew months later, now, with grizzled hands and joint debt, were all reminders of its enduring presence. It was in the goose-related wounds, the mud-stained happiness, and the whispered rumors that somehow became into mythology. It was authentic, disorganized, and the people's. And the peasants would at least have this memories if the world ended tomorrow, as it sometimes attempted to do in the Middle Ages, a day when there were no workers, when life seemed lighter, and when two people said yes to one another in the presence of clucking hens. There were rules before the lyre was plucked or the wine poured, many of them. The Greek Symposia was not a mindless frat party, even with the commotion and hilarity later in the evening. It was limited, ritualized, and oddly holy. You didn't simply arrive and begin drinking. That would have been savage. No, you had to be invited first. The guests were carefully chosen by the host, also referred to as the symposiarch. Only men who were freeborn were involved in this. Slaves? They were in service. Ladies? Inside, only hetairai or courtesans were permitted. Wives remained at home. Everyone would eat the deinon, the evening meal, while lounging on couches and resting their heads on cushions like contented thinkers. This was not the official symposium. The warm-up was this: no alcoholic beverages yet. Then it happened, because the actual event started as soon as the food was cleared and the floor was swept. In a sizable crater, the wine and water were combined. It was deemed uncivilized to consume wine unmixed, as the Scythians did. The ratio was set by the symposiarch. Weak? The reason you're here is to talk. Powerful? Chaos is what you're here for. The line was thin. Too drunk and everything remained rigid. Plato's dialogues became a Dionysian catastrophe because he was too inebriated. This is when things start to get interesting. Each symposium had a goal which was typically lyrical, political, or philosophical. However, beneath all of that was a feeling of hallowed leisure, or schola as the Greeks called it. Time was not squandered. Young aristocrats developed their intellects, engaged in verbal games, wrote spontaneous poetry, and perhaps even fell in love there. It was the birthplace of ideas. Liquor was offered to Dionysus, the god of wine and divine insanity, prior to the commencement of the discussions. Sometimes the visitors themselves sang, and other times it was performed by paid musicians. A girl with a flute could play. A guest may be presented with a riddle by a courtesan. However, everything was planned. The wine moved in a clockwise direction. There was a toast for every round. Fast drinking was discouraged. Being careless was embarrassing. The perfect visitor, witty, elegant, and just inebriated enough to deliver the truth in a wonderful way. Ultimately, the symposium served as a stage for men to demonstrate their intelligence and wine tolerance. It was a dance between excess and reason, and you weren't just making a fool of yourself if you disregarded the rules. The fundamental essence of the event was being insulted by you. The symposium's physical location wasn't by chance. It served as a stage on which the body and mind might perform. Usually the gathering was held in the andron, a specially created space in the Greek home that was only used by men. The area was square and bordered with couches, or clenae, which were sufficiently wide for a man to push himself up on one elbow and lie on his side. The center remained open, making it ideal for dancers to perform, servants to pour wine, or the occasional spontaneous game in which the players had to toss wine lees toward a target. Indeed, they also had drinking games. Flickering oil lamps provided light, and the air was heavy with the aroma of roasting meats, burning incense, and the occasional courtesan's perfume. It was sensual, intimate, and intended to reduce inhibitions without wiping off intelligence. The circular arrangement of the couches promoted mutual laughter, verbal sparring, and eye contact. It was more than architecture. It was psychology. Here, everyone was treated equally. The head of a table was empty. Nobody was superior to anyone else. An egalitarian period in a highly hierarchical world, philosophical democracy was cultivated by this geographical equality. Depending on the host and the mix of guests, the atmosphere could change significantly. A few symposia were actually drinking parties masquerading as political planning meetings. Others turned into naked dance and singing competitions. Additionally, some were high, metaphysical, and even religious in tone, such as the one mentioned in Plato's Symposium. However, they all started in the same spot, sharing a drink, a common area, and a feeling that something significant was going to occur. The decor was important as well. Mythological paintings depicting Hercules eating with the gods, Dionysus guiding his inebriated guests, and satyrs pursuing nymphs were frequently used to decorate walls. These weren't only lovely pictures, they served as a reminder of the thin line separating euphoric anarchy from civilization. "This is play, but it's sacred play," they whispered. Not to mention the wine itself. They were served in kylikes, which were adorned cups with sensual or humorous motifs painted on the bottom that were gradually exposed as the drinker drained his cup. Depending on who was looking, you might have blushed, laughed, or made a witty remark after you drained your drink. The paiderastia relationship between an older man, the erastes, and a younger male, adored, the eromenos, was at the center of symposia, a dynamic that continues to perplex and captivate contemporary minds. This was idealized rather than merely accepted. The older man sponsored intelligence and refinement, taught and loved. The student and object of admiration was the younger man, typically a teenage male of aristocratic birth. Their theater was the symposium. At least in principle, this link wasn't just sexual. It was intended to focus on discipline, virtue, and the transmission of moral character and knowledge. Despite this, romantic tension continued to permeate the symposium's atmosphere. To win over the attractive young people lounging next to them, the older men would recite poetry and employ deft wordplay. Grappling was discouraged, compliments were expected. The secret was moderation. It demonstrated self-control, dignity, and the gravity of one's intentions. On the other hand, it was anticipated that the beloved would object, at least in public. His skill in deflecting advances with wit and grace was his virtue. A boy lost social value if he gave in too easily. A boy who turned everyone away would always run the danger of coming across as aloof or conceited. Everyone was intrigued by the perfect Eromenos. He teased, he reddened, he dodged, and most importantly, he listened. It was expected of him to absorb wisdom as much as affection. Not all of the guests participated in these dynamics, though. Married men were expected to act appropriately. However, many didn't, let's face it. While hetairæ and courtesans were permitted to provide sexual gratification, the lads were supposed to provide something more: motivation. They served as the male elite's muses. Their youth served as a reminder to older men of the transient nature of beauty, the harsh passage of time, and the initial significance of philosophy. In his well-known Symposium, Plato examined the essence of love itself, using eros as a ladder that rises from bodily attraction to contemplation of God. However, that ascent literally started on a couch next to a gorgeous boy. The setting's intimacy allowed for the admission of longing without shame and the discussion of the soul without shame. At the test, wine was more than just a drink. However, Greeks did not drink in the same manner as we do now. They believed that drinking wine without water was a sign of a barbarian. The perfect Greek drank at least 3 parts water to his wine. Why? Wine was intended to loosen the tongue without dulling the mind, not to overwhelm. Like an altar, the central crater, a huge mixing vessel, rested in the center of the space. The wine-to-water ratio was determined by the symposiarch, who was frequently chosen for the evening. He had a lot of power. A crazy night was predicted by a strong mix. A weak one meant a poetry and conversation night. It was a fine line. If you were too sober and the evening went slowly, or too inebriated, you risked throwing up on your neighbor's sandals and gaining lifelong disgrace. The wine was ladled out in rounds, and each visitor received a cup, which was frequently exquisitely painted. Each man took a taste before passing it on, and the flow was clockwise. It was more than simply drinking, though. It had to do with rhythm. Every round included a song, a toast, and a clever comment. Wine encouraged openness, imagination, and even insanity. The Greeks thought that depending on how much you spilled, the god of wine, Dionysus, could either inspire divine insight or total lunacy. And they did pour, but for a reason. Pacing oneself was a skill in itself. A genuinely dignified visitor could sit up straight, recite Homer, trade witty insults, and drink a few rounds. Are you losing control? For barbarians, that is. In actuality, the symposium served as a training ground in part to demonstrate that a true man could have pleasure and still exercise self-control. Even while drunk, self-control was a virtue. However, not every visitor followed the concept. For years, the drunk who threw the lyre player to the ground, danced nude, or thought the serving boy was a satyr, was mocked. They circulated accounts of previous catastrophes as warnings. On the other hand, the drunken thinker who delivered a wonderful speech about the nature of justice or love may live on in the annals of history. At a symposium, philosophical contemplation was not the only activity. The Greeks used games and music, purposeful, structured entertainment that demonstrated a man's vitality, cunning, and social graces as the wine flowed and brains relaxed. a symposium served as a stage for performances as well as a venue for intellectual showmanship. The strange and unexpectedly graceful game of kotobos was one of the most popular. In an attempt to topple it with a well-aimed splash, guests would flick the leftover wine at a target, usually a saucer floating in a basin of water or perched on a stand. Success was symbolic, not solely based on ability. Men frequently screamed out a lover's name as they launched their wine, a playful fusion of athletics and seduction. You hit the mark. Your enthusiasm was accepted by the gods. Miss, perhaps you weren't deserving of either of them. There was always music. A lightress, a hired flute girl, may perform eerie music to go with a toast or a dance in between courses. She occasionally danced herself, moving in step with the evening's growing heat. But instead of only listening, the guests gave a performance. It was mandatory to sing drinking songs, improvise sensual poetry, or recite Homer. It was anticipated. They silently condemned, even pitied, a man who was incapable of delivering a witty rhyme or carrying a melody. The actual performance, however, was verbal. Talking empathetically and with wit was an art. Verbal duels tested one's charm, wit, memory, and philosophical understanding. Men would tell scathing jokes, challenge one another to poetic improvisation, or pose riddles. It was about dexterity, not brutality. The most effective conversationalist was brief, perceptive, and a little bit provocative. Then came the riddles, which may be filthy or philosophical at times. A well-placed riddle has the power to either hush a room or make everyone laugh out loud. A nasty pun and a theory of justice could be delivered simultaneously by the most esteemed guests, and the entire event assumed a wonderful aura, half performance, half revelation, assuming the space was appropriate, the wine was well balanced, and the company was sharp. It all aimed to connect, form ties, and allow desire, intelligence, and personality to blend together rather than only impress. Reputations were built or shattered in this light-hearted mayhem, because in the Greek Symposium, one was evaluated not just on one's thoughts, but also on how well one could express them while intoxicated and wearing a tunic. Hetairae, a different type of woman, roamed freely through the flickering lamplight, while Greek spouses remained behind locked doors, excluded from the symposium's intellectual and sensual realm. These elite courtesans weren't prostitutes or entertainers. They were well-educated, clever, and skilled in conversation, music, and seduction. They were essential to the symposia, not merely attendees. A hetaira could outsmart even the most astute nobleman, discuss intellectual concepts, sing with the lyre, and recite poetry. She was not restricted to the home like other Greek women were. She was able to attend parties, buy property, and even become wealthy. Some became legendary, like as Pericles' renowned lover, Aspasia, who was said to have instructed Athens' brightest brains in eloquence. They were in a complicated position, though. They had to balance being praised and being derided. They were admired for their elegance and intelligence, but they were also the targets of mockery and lust. Nevertheless, the hetaira was frequently the only woman who could speak openly and be heard in the symposium's wine-soaked environment. The dynamic was altered by their presence. The night was no longer merely a boys' club of flirting and philosophy with them. It turned into a tense, erratic dance of performance and power. A hetaira's well-chosen comment might either lower a man's ego or start a heated argument that lasted all night. They were trained to challenge, taunt, and sometimes embarrass others. They were conversational warriors. Although it wasn't always consummated, eroticism was always present. The point was the tension, the flirtation. While some hetairae kept aloof and used their attractiveness as power, others became lovers. They operated according to their own norms, frequently utilizing their intelligence and beauty to advance socially or influence political alliances. These ladies were fantasies for many men, offering feminine companionship without household responsibilities, sensuality without submission, and intelligence without restraint. They were dangerous and intoxicating because they were free in a manner that Greek spouses could never be. The hetairai served as a reminder that real power was never entirely in masculine hands in a space intended for male gratification. They might sabotage a joke, refocus a discussion, or spark an original poem that would go on for generations. They were masters of both in a society that was fixated on performance and power. The Symposium left behind perhaps its most significant intellectual legacy, despite its fair share of games, flirting, and poetic excess. Something amazing occurred beneath the giggling and growing drunkenness. Consideration became serious. These were mental labs, not just get-togethers for drinks. The guests frequently got into arguments that would permanently influence Western philosophy somewhere between the third cup of wine and the last riddle. Plato's Symposium, a fictionalized version of an actual meeting, when Socrates, Alcibiades, Aristophanes, and others discussed the nature of love, is undoubtedly the most well-known example. However, this was not a singular incident. Symposiums were regarded as gathering places for the exchange of ideas across Greece, particularly in Athens. The topics covered included human desire, morality, metaphysics, and public affairs. These arguments were contests of reasoning, wit, and emotional conviction, rather than lectures. The scene was important. Humor softened blows, wine weakened defenses, and the private setting allowed for vulnerability. If you were astute enough, you could gain a man's esteem by questioning his beliefs about justice, the gods, or even his sexual preferences. Eros, or erotic love, not only in the sexual sense but also as a philosophical force, was one of the main topics. Through Plato, Socrates compared love to a ladder. It begins with physical attraction, progresses via admiration of beauty, and ends with reflection on the timeless nature of beauty. That notion? At a symposium it was born. However, other subjects also came up. Describe virtue. How can a man become wise? Is it possible for the soul to live forever? Is pleasure just a diversion, or is it a good in and of itself? These were not questions for academics. They came between gulps of spiced wine, intimate and urgent. The fact that many of the greatest Greek intellectuals, including Socrates, Plato, and Xenophon, attended symposia is no accident. These occasions served as intellectual incubators. They provided a unique blend of challenge, intellect, leisure, and pleasure. Furthermore, the symposia permitted nuance unlike public forums. You may talk freely, change your mind in the middle of a phrase, or present a partially developed concept, and watch where it goes. Despite their poetic appeal and intellectual aspirations, symposia could, and frequently did, degenerate into anarchy. Philosophers dreamed of truth and beauty, but reality, drunk with wine and in a daze, had a way of showing up. The delicate balance between pleasure and order at the symposia didn't always work out, and it failed spectacularly when it did. Consider the attractive, intelligent, and highly scandalous Athenian statesman Alcibiades. In Plato's dialogue, he famously interrupted the symposium while already intoxicated and adorned with Dionysus. He delivered a very intimate and sexually suggestive speech about Socrates rather than a sober analysis of love. It was sentimental, humorous, and almost unsuitable. What could have been a wonderful evening devolved into an unbridled outpouring of intoxicated obsession as the distinction between admiration and want became hazy. Alcibiades' antics, however, were not only embarrassing, they were foretelling. He would later betray Athens, escape to Sparta, change sides once more, and perish in exile. His passion for alcohol, acting, and irresponsibility reflected the worst aspects of symposia culture: charm without moderation, genius without morals. He wasn't by himself either. Symposia served as the catalyst for a number of political scandals. rumors spread swiftly. Who made a daring flirtation? Who became inebriated in the drunken haze? Who swore at a god or insulted a guest? Everything was recorded, muttered, and turned into a weapon. A public career could be destroyed by a single slip-up in a private symposium. Additionally, symposia started to be seen as decadent, particularly in later eras. The initial balance between intelligence and excess swung perilously toward pure hedonism as Athens fell and Rome rose. The watering down of wine had stopped. Instead of poetry, guests competed in gluttony. There were more flute girls than philosophers, and the once holy play turned into a cynical show. Even the renownedly austere Spartans derided Athenian symposia as being corrupt, mushy, and effeminate. They believed that the sheer notion of lounging on couches and discussing love while drinking tainted wine was a surefire way to degenerate morality, and it was, in a sense. Yet the Greeks were aware of the risks. Moderation was highly valued because of this. The real hero of the symposium was a man who could argue without degrading others, charm without seducing, and maintain his dignity while intoxicated. The Greek symposia left behind something far more permanent than a headache, even after the final lyre note faded and the last crater was emptied, a heritage of intellectual culture that continues to influence our current way of thinking, communicating, and relating. What started out as a planned drinking party evolved into one of the most improbable catalysts for social progress, philosophy, and the arts in history. For its time, the symposium presented a groundbreaking notion that leisure was more than just inactivity. It was a hallowed area. The source of our term school is schola, which is Greek, meaning leisure. It's no coincidence. The symposia transformed leisure into a learning environment. It demonstrated that knowledge wasn't limited to classrooms and temples. It might appear in the midst of drinks, giggling, flirting, and heated argument. It is difficult to overestimate the influence of Plato's Symposium, the most well-known artifact in existence. It offered us not just a form of structured philosophical dialogue, but enduring concepts like Platonic love, the ladder of Eros, and the idea that beauty and truth are intricately intertwined. That work's format, men lounging, sipping alcohol, and riffing on a common theme, would be adopted for anything from late-night salons to university seminars. The Romans inherited the symposium and converted it into the convivium, a more lavish, less philosophical gathering, but the format persisted. The symposium's spirit was revived in the salons, circles, and organizations of medieval and Renaissance scholars, and its echoes can still be heard today. The podcast where two minds drink, laugh, and analyze reality. The dinner party that devolves into a profound discussion at midnight. The book club that spends more time discussing existential issues than the book itself. The flaws of the symposium are also marked. The dangers of excess, age, and attractiveness hierarchies, and gender exclusivity are all still pertinent as warnings about how societies are formed and destroyed. But the notion that enjoyment and thought do not have to conflict was probably its greatest gift. That intellect, comedy, beauty, and desire could all be found in one room. That truth could not only be reasoned, but also enticed. Ultimately, philosophy and pleasure were not the only things that came together during the Greek symposium. It was there that civilization learned that the spirit, body, and mind all require a place to play. And the Western world learned to speak in that hallowed, wine-stained room. Imagine strolling around the streets of Memphis or ancient Thebes. The air smells like lotus, palm wine, and incense, while the heat radiates off the limestone. However, it's not the temples or the tall obelisks that catch your eye. People are the problem. Both men and women have thick, black eyeliner applied to their faces, which juts out sharply from the corners of their eyes. Instead of their natural hair, elaborate wigs that are curled, braided, and occasionally scented are used to crown their heads. It's glaring, obvious, and all over the place. Personal appearance was more than just vanity in ancient Egypt. The language was coded. What you painted around your eyes and wore on your head revealed to the world your identity, beliefs, and social position. Eyeliner and wigs weren't just fads. They were declarations of spirituality, identity, and personal hygiene. With meticulous precision, eyeliner was applied using either the more well-known kohl from galena, a black lead sulfide, or a dark green pigment called malachite. It was a daring look, but not just for show. Similar to how modern sportsmen apply black oil, it was thought to shield the eyes from intense sunshine. More significantly, it had deep spiritual and therapeutic meaning. The pigment, according to the ancient Egyptians, offered protection from illnesses and evil spirits, particularly from the bacteria and flies that were always present in the Nile. This was more than just superstition. Lead-based kohl may have possessed antibacterial qualities according to modern science. Thus, sure, eyeliner has the power to save your life. The wigs, on the other hand, were more than just stylish headgear. Hair was shaved regularly to preserve cleanliness and prevent lice. Elites wore wigs on a regular basis, whereas commoners wore them on special occasions. The complexity varied along with the material, which could be human hair, plant fiber, or wool. Some were tall structures of curls, beads, and even gold embellishments, while others were just plain plaits. Like a well-tailored suit or high-end handbag today, a well-made wig was costly and a sign of affluence. Together, the wig and the eyeliner produced a persona, controlled, composed, and religious. It would be unimaginable to go out in public without them, particularly for members of the higher classes. It was more than simply appearances. It was about being in peace with the gods, clean, civilized, and protected. Kohl was more than just cosmetics to the ancient Egyptians. It was protection, identification, and even a form of prayer. Both men and women, rich and poor, lined their eyes with dramatic strokes of black, pushing the color out toward the temples in exquisite sweeping arcs. And even though it looked awesome, they didn't do it for that reason. The eyes were sacred, therefore they did it. Mesdem, the old word for eye makeup, was applied almost ritualistically. Galena, a dark gray mineral that was finely powdered and combined with oils or animal fat, was used to make the most popular mixture. It created the recognizable black eyeliner that characterized Egyptian faces for centuries when applied with a stick. However, it was not just about appearances. Galena was believed to ward off disease and bad luck. It was magic, not just paint. What's up with the eye obsession? Because the eye was powerful in Egyptian mythology. One of the most enduring representations of royal power and protection, the Eye of Horus, stood for completeness and healing. Invoking this protective symbol by lining one's eyelids with kohl was a way to both physically and spiritually protect oneself from harm, and in the ancient world, protection was a serious concern. Despite being the source of life, the Nile also brought with it bacteria, dust, flies, and other parasites. These were commonplace worries. It's possible that kohl served as an early antibacterial barrier and sunblock. In fact, archaeologists discovered that the lead salts in kohl boosted the skin's synthesis of nitric oxide, which supports the immune system. Therefore, it actually did heal while it adorned. However, not everyone used kohl in the same way. Finely ground galena and ornamental applicators of polished wood or ivory were available to the wealthy. Poorer people may use crushed charcoal or simpler equivalents. However, the need to shield and embellish the eyes went beyond social status. Even laborers had lined eyes, which is a kind of commonplace holiness. It's interesting to note that painting one's eyes was quite sensual, and not only in the sense of contemporary cosmetics, it was personal. You have to prepare your soul in order to ready your eyes for the world. Along the lash line, it represented a link to the sensual, the hygienic, and the sacred. Your hair, more specifically your wig, told people everything they needed to know about you in ancient Egypt. how pure you were, how wealthy you were, and how near the gods you were. There was more to wigs than vanity. They were a single, exquisite headgear that combined status, functionality, and ritual. Let's begin with the fundamentals. In Egypt, most people shaved their heads. The motivations were cultural and pragmatic. It was hot, humid, and a breeding ground for lice in the hot Egyptian heat. It was much more comfortable, cleaner, and cooler to shave it off. However, going bald didn't exactly exude style. Now let's get the wig on. Priests, pharaohs, wealthy nobles, and other members of the elite typically wore wigs. However, there were simpler variants even among middle-class people. Depending on your social status, different materials were used to make them. The wealthiest Egyptians ordered human hair wigs, occasionally combined with sheep's wool or plant fibers, to give them structure and volume. These wigs, which were frequently set with beeswax and scented cones of fat that gradually melted into the scalp as the day went on, might be dressed with intricate curls, tight braids, or layered plaits. Luxurious, to put it simply. Additionally, the designs and shapes made a statement. Long flowing hair with golden pearls shouted regal might, while a short, geometric haircut may denote a formal event. High priests frequently wore particular styles that were related to their temple responsibilities, and children, even royal ones, were occasionally portrayed with the well-known side lock of youth, which is typically shaven clean, save for one elaborate braid. Wigs, however, served as more than simply decorative armor. They have profound symbolic meaning. Covering one's head was a sign of divine harmony, purity, and control. To emphasize the distinction between outward appearance and spiritual sanctity, priests would wear wigs during ceremonies outside of temples, but shaved totally before entering. Wigs were eventually buried with their owners or passed down as heirlooms. A delicate wig, with its strands still in shape after millennia, might be buried with care in a tomb. Even some mummies have been discovered with their wigs still in place, their tight curls and beautiful braids laying over a silent face as if they were prepared for the hereafter. Perfume cones were the halo if wigs were the crown. Fragrances were literally worn on the head in ancient Egypt, and no ensemble was complete without them. Perched atop intricately braided wigs, these strange-looking blobs that we find in Egyptian art were more than just decorative accents. They were solid concoctions of oils, fats, and fragrances called perfume cones, which were intended to dissolve gradually and fill the wearer with heavenly fragrance. Myrrh, frankincense, lotus, or cinnamon were added to a base of animal fat or beeswax to create the cones. The cones would gradually soften and release their fragrance as the day wore on and the desert sun beat down. This was a statement, not merely something done for fun. I smell like the gods, I am holy, and I am clean. In Egypt, scent considered a moral good rather than a pleasure. Godliness literally came after cleanliness. Temples burned incense every day to welcome the gods, who were thought to be fragrant. Not only was it visually pleasing to stroll through a city filled with the scent of frankincense or lotus, but it also had a spiritual resonance. A person who used perfume was considered cultured, and in accordance with Ma'at, the Egyptian concept of cosmic order and balance. Additionally, perfume cones weren't reserved for particular events. The daily practice of anointing the body with oils and scented balms was widespread among all classes of Egyptians, although the elite wore them to banquets and celebrations. Workers would wash and oil themselves after working in the sun for a day. It was a component of being worthy and human. Wigs frequently have a distinct smell as well. Some were kept in storage with herbs or leaves that were scented woven right into the strands. Others had their fibers carefully rubbed with oils to revitalize them. The hair of a wealthy Egyptian was not only attractive, but it also had a wonderful scent. Additionally, that scent conveyed erotic attractiveness, piety, status, and everything else. It's interesting to note that this focus on scent has useful advantages as well. In Egypt's dry climate, the melting cones protected the hair and scalp by acting as a moisturizer. Insects might have been repelled by them. Once more, function and beauty went hand in hand. The egalitarian attitude toward makeup that characterized ancient Egyptian beauty culture was among its most remarkable aspects. Ancient Egypt blurs the boundaries in a society where women are typically assigned makeup and grooming duties by current norms. Everybody oiled their skin, scented their bodies, shaved their heads, donned wigs on special occasions, and men applied eyeliner. Beauty was highly social, sanitary, and religious. It was not gendered. An Egyptian man of great status could wash his entire body first thing in the morning and then anoint himself with fragrant oils. After that, kohl was applied. Yes, both the upper and lower eyelids should have thick, black eyeliner applied with a smooth hand. With that recognizable line that we still identify with gods and pharaohs, the eyes were stretched outward. It was identity, not vanity. Women performed the same process, but their hair and fragrance were even more intricate. Elite ladies were expected to have big, defined eyes, ochre or carmine-painted lips, extravagant hairstyles, and deep, pale skin. Here's the twist, though. The purpose of these routines was not to impress men or compete with other ladies. Aligning oneself with the divine was their focus. The gods themselves were, after all, shown in their full regalia, richly decorated, dazzling, and beautified. In actuality, androgyny was a potent motif in Egyptian imagery. Gender roles were continuously blurred by the gods. The fertility and beauty goddess Hathor was sensual and maternal. The underworld's ruler, Osiris, was portrayed as having green skin, a false beard, and barely hyper-masculine makeup. Curiously genderless characteristics were used to depict even pharaohs like as Akhenaten. Wide hips, almond eyes, and soft tummies. A society where attractiveness was not only accepted but expected was brought about by the cultural acceptance of beauty across genders. A guy could be viewed as indolent, uncultured, or even irreligious if he didn't wear perfume or line his eyes. Personal grooming was a responsibility, not a luxury. Even laborers and servants participated in the ceremony, but using less complex materials. They may substitute linen wigs for real hair, plant oils for pricey perfume, and soot for galena. The impulse, however, remained the same: to portray oneself as respectable, whole, and clean. Being clean meant being near the gods in ancient Egypt. Not only was dirt disagreeable, it was unholy. And one way to practice spiritual discipline was through personal hygiene. For this reason, cosmetics, eyeliner, wigs, and fragrances weren't merely luxuries or signs of riches. They served as tangible evidence of your social standing, discipline, and deservingness of participation in society. Let's begin with the fundamentals. Hair. Both men and women frequently shaved their heads and bodies. Sweat and lice were trapped in hair. Adversaries in the arid environment. Order, self-control, and spiritual cleanliness were all represented by a clean-shaven scalp. Priests who worked in temples were therefore expected to bathe many times a day and shave thoroughly. Their ceremonial responsibilities required not only piety but also outward purity. After that, wigs evolved into a useful and symbolic answer that provided style while maintaining ceremonial cleanliness underneath. Everyone who could afford the time and water took a bath every day. Your hygiene regimen became more complex as your wealth increased. In affluent homes, maids poured water scented with rose petals or lotuses over your body in footed basins. To keep the skin supple, you would scrub yourself with natron, a naturally occurring mineral salt that doubled as soap, and then generously apply oil. Additionally, your scent conveyed your value to others. You could get through the day with a cheap oil derived from castor or moringa, but lotus, cinnamon, or frankincense oils would be better. Those distinguished you as a person. It was a mark of respectability to be scented and clean. Being unclean or odorous was a social disgrace as much as a personal shortcoming. How does your eyeliner look? Another obvious indicator of class was the grade of your coal, the minerals it contained, the fineness of its grinding, and the creative application. Cheap materials or sloppy lines would instantly expose you. Alabaster or ivory could be used to make a nobleman's coal case. A labourer's hastily carved out of wood or clay. Additionally, clothing strengthened these indications of hygiene. White, light linen was favoured because it was hygienic, airy, and represented purity. Unwashed clothing or stains denoted indolence or poor status. Beauty in ancient Egypt persisted beyond the afterlife and wasn't reserved for the living. To go with the deceased, the same kohl, wigs, and fragrances that in everyday life denoted hygienic, refined, and devoted behavior were meticulously placed in graves. For the Egyptians, death was a transition rather than the end, and you were supposed to look your best when you met the gods. Grave items and tomb paintings demonstrate the close connection between funeral activities and beauty rituals. Coal pots, wig boxes, mirrors, perfumed perfumes, jars of makeup, and even combs and razors were interred alongside elite mummies. In certain instances, the deceased was portrayed on the coffin itself, sporting intricately painted eyes and immaculately combed hair, frequently donning a ceremonial wig embellished with lapis or gold. It was an obvious message: the soul should be pure, calm, and divine when it enters the next realm. Cosmetic application was part of the rites done by the priests who prepared the body. Before covering the body with linen, they applied oils to the skin, painted black lines on the eyes, and occasionally even dressed the deceased with a wig. Preserving the body and elevating the spirit were the two goals. Here, beauty was transformative rather than merely ceremonial. One of the most important rituals for the deceased, the opening of the mouth ceremony, symbolically gave the deceased person back their senses of sight, smell, and speech. The deceased's exquisitely lined eyes were more than just a metaphor. In the hereafter, they were supposed to cross paths again. The polished mirrors made sure the deceased might forever gaze upon their own perfected form, and the perfume cones and sacred oils allowed the ghost to inhale the beautiful air of paradise. Even the gods of protection and death were portrayed as lovely. The jackal-headed embalmer Anubis is depicted with sleek, idealized features and black-lined eyes. The guardians of the dead, Isis and Nephthys, were frequently depicted with flawless hair and exquisite makeup, serving as role models for both the living and the dead. For the Egyptians, being well-groomed in death meant honoring the gods and indicating that one was prepared for reincarnation, decaying, smelling, and looking disheveled. These were spiritual shortcomings as well as physical ones. Beneath the grandeur of ancient Egyptian ceremonies, there was a universe of useful tools that were astonishingly sophisticated, well-made, and ritualized. You didn't just tap coal with your finger or comb through your hair mindlessly if you were an elite Egyptian getting ready for a banquet, temple service, or your own funeral. Your own beauty kit was frequently as exquisitely crafted and symbolic as any sacred relic. First, let's talk about mirrors. For those who could afford them, these portable discs, which were made of polished copper or bronze, shone enough to vividly reflect the face. Often fashioned after gods, lotus stems, or protecting deities, these mirrors had elaborate handles carved from wood, ivory, or faience. Looking into one served as a reminder of symmetry, order, and heavenly harmony, in addition as being a source of vanity. Applicators for coal were also necessary. Instead of being delicate brushes, these were thin rods that were occasionally carved out of metal, ivory, or bone, and were meant to be dipped into ceramic or stone pots that contained powdered malachite or galena. Using these instruments to line one's eyes was frequently a meticulous, meditative, and meticulous process. Some of these applicators were buried with their owners because they were so highly valued. Wide, flat wig combs made of ivory or carved wood were used to gently detangle the complex curls and braids of ornate wigs. Richer people possessed complete grooming sets that included tweezers for removing unwanted hair, razors for shaving, and even perfume jars to store different scented balms. Some powerful women even employed attendants whose only responsibility was to manufacture custom perfume mixtures and upkeep wigs. Almost every home had a cosmetic palette, which was slabs of stone used to combine and ground pigments. Small palettes were occasionally found in children's tombs as well, suggesting the origins of early beautification practices. One of Egypt's first archaeological discoveries, the well-known Nama palette, combines politics, ritual, and beauty into one stone by demonstrating cosmetic instruments that were in use from the very beginning of Egyptian civilization. These were not drawer-hidden tools, they were on display with pride. They acted as reminders that beauty and life were intertwined, frequently embellished with animal motifs or engraved with protective spells. It was at the heart of it. You weren't merely trying to look good. Using instruments that have been blessed by centuries of tradition, you were engaging in a sacred art form. The last pharaoh to apply kohl or a noblewoman to set a perfumed cone on top of her wig was thousands of years ago. However, the visual language of ancient Egyptian beauty has persisted throughout history, appearing in everything from contemporary cosmetics techniques to high fashion. Catwalks, cosmetics, and cultural imagination are all examples of what started out as a social necessity and religious ceremony along the banks of the Nile. Start with eyeliner, that striking, long line from the corner of the eye, that distinctive Egyptian cat eye. Although she didn't create the style, Cleopatra did master it. Additionally, Egyptian eye makeup became a worldwide emblem of power, mystery, and intrigue once her image was extensively shared in art and film. High fashion and everyday glam eyeliner trends now continue to strive for the same lengthy, dramatic shape that originated in Hathor's temples and queens' tombs. Wigs have also been around. The ancient Egyptians viewed them as symbols of power, rank, and hygiene rather than just fashion. Celebrities, cancer survivors, and cultural performers all openly wear them today as symbols of individuality, empowerment, and transformation. The modern wig conveys the same message in many respects. I make decisions about how I show myself to the outside world, and skincare is no exception. Early practitioners of body moisturizing, exfoliation, and fragrance were the Egyptians. They employed clays, oils, and salts not just for practical purposes, but also as manifestations of discipline and spirituality. The DNA of today's multi-step skincare regimens can be directly linked to the Theban anointing jars. Ancient Egyptian beauty endures even in popular culture. The force of Tutankhamun's dramatic mask or Nefertiti's cheekbones is constantly used in movies, music videos, fashion displays, and cosmetics branding. These were icons, not simply members of the royal family. Once based on religious belief, their criteria of beauty have evolved into a shorthand for grace and mystique. The notion that beauty is more than just appearances, however, endures the most. For the Egyptians, it represented identity, health, sanctity, and social structure, all of which were shown in curled wigs and painted in black coal. Furthermore, their message is ageless in a civilization that continues to struggle with ritual, self-expression, and image. Beauty is strength. Beauty is defense. Purpose is what beauty is. And that truth continues to line our eyes from the Karnak temples to the vanities of today. 3 small ships, Susan Constant, Godspeed, and Discovery, sailed away from the misty English coasts in the final days of 1606 under the Virginia Company's flag. The Virginia Company, a private joint stock company, was not embarking on this expedition for the honor of the crown or for charitable purposes. It was a commercial endeavor motivated mostly by the desire for profit, but also by aspirations of gold, silk, and spices. Instead, they received mud, sickness, famine, and a small, vulnerable colony that would eventually become the foundation of British America. These ships had a strange mix of men on board. In addition to skilled laborers and sailors, there were plenty of gentlemen, men with titles and swords who had never farmed. The majority were clueless about colony construction. Few had ever engaged in strenuous manual labor. The reality that awaited them across the Atlantic was far from what they had anticipated. The mission eventually reached what would later be known as Virginia after more than 4 months at sea, which included a stop in the Canary Islands and a storm-battered voyage across the Caribbean. The immigrants decided to establish their settlement on a marshy, deserted peninsula beside the James River on May 14, 1607. In honor of King James III, they called it Jamestown. The location appeared perfect from a defensive perspective. It was protected from potential native attacks by being surrounded by water on 3 sides and enough inland to evade the Spanish Navy's notice. However, there was a price for the site. Poor soil, a lot of mosquitoes, and brackish, unfit water. It was a deadly trap in practically every way. Nevertheless, they started building a wooden fort after unloading their supplies. Little did the settlers know what lay ahead. There was a small supply line that ran over the ocean, harsh summers and cold winters. The sickness spread in a few weeks. They were ill from the water, there wasn't much food, there was frequent arguing and poor leadership. Nevertheless, they set the foundation for what would later become an empire in that wretched, mosquito-infested stretch of land. It was a huge gamble. The danger was enormous, but they were blind to the impending catastrophe because they were so focused on the idea of empire, riches, and glory. They had established Jamestown. However, survival, that was a different story. Death started its steady, unrelenting march as soon as the settlers stepped foot on Jamestown's land. There was so much promise in the land, but the harsh reality set in. The brackish water was too contaminated to sustain life and too salty to consume. The land was swampy and sandy, and crops did not grow. Additionally, the men were not equipped to hunt, fish, or cultivate efficiently because they were largely unaccustomed to hard labor. Malaria, typhoid, and dysentery spread in a matter of weeks. Almost quickly, food supplies became scarce. Their initial supplies, transported across the Atlantic, were never intended to last a full year. The inhabitants had anticipated some rapid local harvests, as well as frequent resupply shipments. Neither came to pass. Rather from being farmers, the majority of colonists were gentlemen or artisans. Too many of them rejected manual labor completely, believing it beneath their status, and they lacked the skills necessary to cultivate crops in a new climate. The 1607 summer was unbearably hot. The populace was decimated by disease. There were insects everywhere. Their condition only became worse when they drank water from the river. The settlers resorted to more drastic methods as the hunger became more acute. To make broth, they cooked leather. They foraged for acorns, roots, and even rats and snakes. By winter, dreadfully referred to as the starving time, things had gotten out of hand. The colony was besieged that winter by nature and their own arrogance, not by Native Americans. Trade stopped when tensions with the Powhatan Confederacy increased, and Captain John Smith was hurt. In the face of hostile woodlands and frigid temperatures, the settlers were essentially confined inside the wooden walls of their fort. Unimaginable behaviors were recounted by witnesses. In order to survive, the colonists turned to cannibalism, cooking human flesh and excavating bodies. One of the colony's leaders, George Percy, later described how they were compelled to eat the things that nature detested the most due to their unbearable hunger. Only about 60 of the approximately 500 colonists who were alive in the fall of 1609 made it until spring. If there was a pivotal moment in the early instability of Jamestown, It was Captain John Smith. Smith was not a nobleman. He was a soldier, an adventurer, and, since he loved everyone, a veteran of many conflicts. He didn't have a pretentious title or wear a powdered wig, but he made up for his lack of social position with bravery, boldness, and hard-won experience, exactly what the struggling colony needed. As the death toll increased and morale was on the verge of collapsing, by the fall of 1608, Smith assumed charge. He asked, in an impolite manner, he took charge. Those gentlemen who had declined to work were subjected to his notorious policy. Whoever refuses to work will not eat. There was no metaphor in it. Smith organized the settlers into work gangs to secure firewood, build, and farm in order to compel labor. Even the gentlemen were not exempt. There was no regard for social status in starvation. Smith also understood how important it was to establish ties with the nearby Powhatan tribes. Where others had shown suspicion or animosity toward the locals, Smith introduced force-backed diplomacy. Using presents, threats, and calculated displays of strength, he exchanged corn and grain for copper pots and beads. Although these interactions weren't always amicable, they frequently succeeded. Smith's ability to obtain food prevented the colony from collapsing completely during a period when famine plagued every meal. He created the first precise maps of the Chesapeake Bay by mapping it with military accuracy. Future inhabitants would find these extremely useful. The English knew very little about the region they claimed, as his exploration also showed. They were not alone. They were outnumbered by the strong, well-organized local communities that surrounding them. Smith was unloved in spite of his accomplishments. He was quick to disparage his adversaries, which in Jamestown were almost everyone, and he was harsh and conceited. He suffered severe injuries in a gunpowder explosion in 1609. The outcome was irrevocable, regardless of whether it was an accident or sabotage. Smith returned to England. Jamestown descended into chaos again without his guidance, yet the discipline, diplomacy, and survival he established had an impact. A utopia was not constructed by Captain John Smith. He created an opportunity which was more than most people could handle in the Virginia woods. The place the English landed on was already controlled long before they ever set sail. It was hardly a desolate area, rather it was the center of the Powhatan Confederacy, a huge and potent Native American kingdom. This coalition of more than 30 tribes ruled the whole Chesapeake under the leadership of Wahun Seneca, who the English simply called Chief Powhatan. They had developed villages, crops, networks of trade, and a sophisticated governmental structure. Pioneers were not the English. They were trespassers. Chief Powhatan initially saw a chance. The Powhatans prized the metal tools, weapons, mirrors, and beads that the immigrants brought. If the English stayed small and reliant, a restricted connection may be beneficial. Food and trade were traded early on. Despite its tension, diplomacy was always in a dangerous position. One person stood out as a representation of serenity in this heated environment: Pocahontas. Although she was not a princess in the European sense, she was significant politically as Chief Powhatan's daughter, who was probably 10 or 11 years old at the time. She notably spared John Smith's life from execution in 1607, while contemporary academics question if the narrative was made up, misconstrued, or embellished. In any case, Pocahontas started to appear frequently in English stories, frequently serving as a liaison or bridge between the two civilizations. However, the truce was short-lived. English demands for power, food, and land increased along with Jamestown's growth. When trade stalled, the settlers plundered communities. The Powhatan warriors struck back. Trust was rapidly damaged. The Powhatans saw the land as a place to dwell, but the English saw it as something to own. It was nearly hard to coexist peacefully because of this disparity in perspective. The relationship had collapsed by 1609. Jamestown was deprived of food and water during the terrible starving time, as a result of the Powhatan Confederacy's siege warfare operation. They ambushed and slaughtered any settlers they discovered outside the fort. Inside, colonists perished from malnutrition or illness. Powhatan was sending a message in this power struggle. No one was going to take this land. Defiant despite their weakness, the English refused to leave the colony. They thought the Empire and God were on their side. They thought they were protecting their home, the Powhatan thought. There was more to the battle for Virginia than merely territory. It had to do with survival, independence, and not bowing. Pocahontas is one of the most romanticized and misinterpreted figures in early American history. Her tale of a native princess rescuing a white Englishman and uniting two cultures via a single act of love has been a folk tale for ages. The reality is much more dismal and complicated. Chief Powhatan's daughter, Pocahontas, actual name Matawaka, was probably no more than 11 or 12 when the English came. Her relationship with John Smith played a major role in her early contacts with the colonists. She became a symbol of connection between Jamestown and the Powhatan, regardless of whether she actually saved Smith's life, as he later claimed. She helped organize food exchanges, brought messages, and made sporadic appearances at the settlement, not as an exotic curiosity, but as a political figure in her own right. For a number of years, Pocahontas vanished from the English record as hostilities escalated and diplomacy broke down. Then everything changed in 1613. Pocahontas was taken prisoner by the English and used as a negotiating chip during one of the several clashes between the colonists and indigenous groups. Her kidnappers demanded her father return English detainees and stolen weapons. Powhatan, the chief, paused. Pocahontas was still held captive. Pocahontas became a Christian and was baptized as Rebecca while she was imprisoned. While some claim she converted voluntarily, others contend she was forced to do so. In any case, the change made her a perfect subject for colonial propaganda. In 1614, she wed tobacco planter John Rolfe. In what became known as the Peace of Pocahontas, their alliance served to briefly ensure harmony between the English and the Powhatan. This was no fairy tale, however. Pocahontas never went back to her people's way of life. She was sent to England in 1616 to serve as a living testimonial to the Jamestown experiment's success. Her identity was supplanted by colonial ambition, as she was paraded before aristocrats and King James himself, wearing English robes and speaking their language. Pocahontas unexpectedly passed away in 1617, most likely from illness, while she was getting ready to return to Virginia. She was about 21 years old. Any hope that peace between the Powhatan and the English could be maintained was dashed by her passing. Pocahontas never truly belonged to one of the two worlds she lived in. She represented assimilation and conquest to the English. Maybe a sad reminder of what was disappearing to her people. Jamestown has barely survived conflict, disease, famine, and leadership changes by 1610. The Virginia Company's top priority, profit, was still absent from the colony. No silk, no gold, and no spices were present. Jamestown was beginning to appear to be a costly failure. Colonization was pricey, and investors in London were becoming restless. The settlers discovered tobacco, a bitter, leafy plant, to be the cash crop they needed, something the English market would demand. Enter John Rolfe, a young widower and aspirational planter who introduced Nicotiana tabacum, a tobacco seed variety from the Caribbean. This imported tobacco was smoother, gentler, and much more addictive than the Powhatan's harsher native type. It was a huge hit with English consumers. Rolfe had successfully grown his first crop by 1612. In a few years, tobacco turned Jamestown from a desolate outpost into a thriving business. The warm, humid climate of Virginia was ideal for the plant's growth. Once hostile area became agricultural riches as tobacco fields spread outside from the fortified town. Tobacco had a cost, but the English had discovered a cause to stay. The crop rapidly depleted soil nutrients, necessitating an increasing amount of land to sustain production. Tensions with the Powhatan were heightened by the encroachment on native territory. Profit-seeking directly conflicted with the survival of the indigenous people. Labor was another concern. Tobacco required a great deal of work. Indentured servants, impoverished Europeans who labored for several years in return for passage to the New World, were first the English's main source of labor. However, this was insufficient as well. In order to meet the demand, Jamestown would start importing Africans into the country in a matter of decades, setting the stage for a cruel system of slavery that would influence American history for centuries to come. Tobacco, however, kept the colony alive. Exports increased dramatically. There were new settlers. Grants of land increased. An imperial experiment was no longer all that Jamestown was. It was a successful, working settlement. It wasn't the future the Virginia Company originally envisioned. They had fantasized of constructing civilizations and discovering gold mines. They ended up with tobacco fields and a swampy stretch of land. However, it was successful, and it was sufficient for England. Not only did tobacco preserve Jamestown, it tied the American colony's future to labor, soil, and a lethal form of success. A ship anchored close to Point Comfort, which is close to Jamestown, in August of 1619. About 20 African men and women were on board. They were taken prisoner by Portuguese traders, taken by English privateers, and then sold to the English colonists. Their arrival, the first known case of Africans being brought to English North America, marked a moment that was both modest and significant. On its way to the Spanish colonies, the White Lion had taken its human cargo from a Portuguese slave ship. Once in Virginia, the Africans were exchanged for food and supplies. Historians continue to question their precise legal status, while official documents designate them as 20 and odd Negroes. Were they treated as indentured servants who were supposed to gain freedom over time, or were they considered slaves in the true sense of the word? The reality is dark and complicated. Some Africans, like Anthony and Isabella, did achieve freedom and even acquire property, according to early documents. But as tobacco earnings soared and labor requirements increased, the lines between indentured servitude and racial slavery began to stiffen. What started off vaguely would develop into a strict system of chattel slavery based on race in a matter of decades. These Africans initially joined a colony that was already reliant on forced labor. More laborers were needed in the tobacco fields than the English could supply. European indentured laborers were either escaping into the frontier or dying of illness. African labor, which was thought to be more resilient and less expensive over time, provided a solution to the colonial economy's need. Many people believed that the arrival in 1619 was a turning point in American history, not only for Jamestown but also for the country that would develop centuries later. It signaled the start of a system of racial castes that would influence economics, laws, and identities for many years. But it probably went unnoticed at the time. Speeches, recordings of fury, and a feeling of a turning point in history were all absent. In a colony based on profit and survival, just another transaction. However, the legacy was significant. After being denied their freedom, family, and nation, those first Africans settled in Virginia. A protracted, agonizing period of American history would emerge from their hardship and tenacity. English America wasn't the only thing that came from Jamestown. The American system of racial slavery was also just getting started. Jamestown was more than a run-down garrison, barely surviving by 1619. It was an economic engine driven by both indentured and enslaved labor, and it was fueled by tobacco. However, when the Virginia Company's remote managers in London disregarded colonial necessities, profit alone was unable to unite a people. A voice was required by the settlers. What they received would influence English America's representational system of government. Governor George Yeardley called 22 elected burgesses from several James River villages to the First General Assembly, which was held at Jamestown's church in July 1619. Colonists electing their own lawmakers to pass legislation, collect taxes, and handle local issues was an unusual undertaking. Over the course of 3 days, these burgesses enacted laws governing the allocation of land, trading with indigenous groups, and even punishments for intoxication, a cruel irony in a colony where tobacco and wine were readily available. There were flaws with this representative body. Only free male landowners, property owners, or those with a tobacco yield were eligible to vote. However, it created a principle: consent, not only royal decree, was the source of political authority. New settlers turned to their elected burgesses rather than the company's distant directors when they opposed to unfair levies or arbitrary arrests. Residents of Jamestown now had a way to safeguard their interests, if only they could maintain it in times of emergency. The trouble came quickly. In 1622, the Powhatan Confederacy mounted a concerted attack that murdered a fourth of the colony in one morning after English reinforcements failed to arrive. At Smith's Hundred, the General Assembly met again to discuss defense and welfare emergency measures. They set up food stores, controlled trade permits, and permitted militias. The Assembly evolved into a lifeline as well as a legislative entity. However, the poor management of the Virginia Company continued. King James I became enraged after hearing about misappropriated money, high mortality, and sporadic supplies. He declared Virginia a royal colony in 1624 and revoked the company's charter. As a lasting legacy of 1619, the General Assembly persisted, even though Jamestown's governor was now chosen by the Crown. Jamestown's self-government demonstrated its worth through economic turmoil, murderous attacks, and the breakdown of the charter. From a commercial enterprise, the colony had evolved into a political society, creating institutions that would endure beyond its mud and mosquito cradle. The notion that common colonists could choose representatives was ingrained in English America's fabric as tobacco fields grew and newcomers came, like a seed sown in a dilapidated Jamestown church that would eventually bear fruit for decades to come. Jamestown had transformed from a faltering outpost into something completely new by the middle of the 1620s, the practical and symbolic center of English America. But it had been cruel to survive. Exploitation, disease, violence, and poverty had claimed thousands of lives. However, the settlement's tenacity established a precedent that would influence the colonies that followed, the U.S. itself, and the contemporary world. Jamestown set important precedents that were both positive and concerning. In terms of politics, it was the first in North America to implement representative government. The foundation of American democracy was laid by the General Assembly, which was established in 1619 and provided settlers with a direct say in local legislation and taxes. It demonstrated the colonists that they were capable of autonomous, albeit imperfect, self-government. This ingrained legacy of self-rule would serve as the catalyst for the revolutionary spirit when tensions finally developed between colonies and the British Crown. Jamestown's success with tobacco had a similarly significant economic impact, tying future American prosperity to agricultural exports. The plantation economy that sprang from tobacco growing required enormous amounts of labor and land. Indentured servitude was the first result of this labor-hungry desire, but it quickly developed into the full-fledged system of racial slavery that would characterize the American South for centuries. Jamestown also made an enduring cultural impact. From the murky shores of the James River, English customs, laws, language, and religious beliefs extended to communities along the Atlantic coast and beyond. However, it also promoted a violent and racially divided culture, which was exemplified by wars with indigenous populations and the exploitation of Africans held in slavery. Early sowing of these seeds would result in generations of structural injustice and hardship. Perhaps the greatest cost was borne by the Powhatan people. Within decades, a whole way of life was destroyed as sickness and conflict wiped off their population. This tragic loss was entwined with Jamestown's prosperity, which was founded on tobacco and self-government. This dichotomy is at the heart of American history. Jamestown is now viewed as a tale of survival, bravery, avarice, persecution, and ingenuity, rather than a straightforward victory. Its legacy endures in the democratic institutions that grew out of its muddy streets, in the cross-cultural interactions that changed the course of world history, and in the profound scars that continue to scar the soul of the country. In the end, Jamestown's real legacy is complexity, a story that is difficult to reduce to heroes or villains. Rather, it continues to serve as an unvarnished, honest window into what America would develop into, a bold, conflicted, creative, and frequently agonizingly human nation.